international community, to the U.S. foreign policy community, to our nation's allies and adversaries. As this committee moves forward, we will continue our work on behalf of the American people as we have done for more than 2 centuries. The world faces challenges as well as opportunities. This committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, its members and staff play a critical role in meeting the challenges America faces in national security. And as I accept the chairmanship with great humility, thanks to the support of our members, thanks to the support of Ranking Member Risch, and thanks to our dedicated and hardworking committee staff, we will continue to advance our values and national interests on the global stage. My priority is simple: to strengthen America's diplomacy, to make sure our diplomats have the tools that they need, and Congress provides the appropriate oversight in carrying out that responsibility. All needs to be done in promoting American values of democracy, anti-corruption, good governance, human rights, transparency. These are the values that give strength to America's foreign policy. Effective international development is a critical part of this effort. The American approach to entrepreneurialism, with individuals building businesses that contribute our shared economy, has fueled much of this country's success. Promoting growth that sustains a middle class and holds government accountable is vital. Over the decades, we have experimented with different ways to make economic diplomacy part of our efforts abroad. From the Marshall Plan to loan programs for women in rural areas to purchase cattle, we have different tools in different contexts. But we know that economic development and finance are essential for stable economies. And stable economies lead to stable countries, which lead to prosperity and security for all. So today, I'd like to hear about how the Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, is fulfilling its mandate. It was established in 2018 by the BUILD Act, which I know many of our colleagues on this committee worked tirelessly to get that done. This is the first hearing the Foreign Relations Committee is holding to look at how you're doing and what we need to consider as the authorization comes up for renewal. So, Mr. Nathan, I want to welcome you to this very important hearing. From West Africa to the Western Hemisphere, DFC's loans, insurance, and investments make a positive impact on development, on energy and healthcare, on technology and innovation, on women's empowerment, and addressing the climate crisis. I want to commend the work of the DFC. You've improved energy security with gas investments in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. You made telecom networks more reliable in the Gambia and Sierra Leone, and you strengthened conservation efforts through the Blue Bonds in Ecuador. You are helping secure global solar energy supply chains and investments in India. Your work harnesses renewable sources, and you do so without forced labor that we see in the People's Republic of China. The kinds of investments and development models that the DFC champions are what makes the United States a better partner in comparison to China's debt trap diplomacy efforts. As we consider the reauthorization, we need to continue to make sure that the United States remains a preferred investment partner. We need to make sure we have the tools to match our allies' capabilities, and with that we are good stewards of the taxpayer monies. So here are some of the challenges that we confront that I hope we'll have a chance to discuss during this hearing. We need to talk about the scoring issues with the Equity Investment Program. We need to tackle DFC's maximum contingent liability cap. And we need to figure out how we can expand the eligibility pools where DFC can pursue deals. I also believe we need more transparency on financing deals. The DFC has been slow to establish accountability measures required by the BUILD Act. I specifically refer to the Development Advisory Council and an independent accountability mechanism. The DFC must diversify more of its funding away from the world's biggest banks, and it must make sure to properly vet microlenders so we can right any wrongs when loans don't go as planned. And I hope you will lay out your proposal to reorganize the DFC. How do you see this improving the DFC's operations and its ability to advance our national security and foreign policy objectives? Mr. Nathan, I also expect you to address the concerns the committee's heard from DFC labor unions and how you're going to involve the workforce in your reorganization plans. Finally, I want to underline that I am committed to working with everyone on this committee to develop the bill reauthorization and move it forward. With that, let me turn to our very distinguished ranking member, Senator Risch, with my thanks for his help as I've assumed the chairmanship.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the chairmanship. You and I have worked together on a number of things in the past, and I look forward to doing so in the future. For those of us who watch this committee, changes are inevitable on the committee, but we have a process in place for seamless transition. There is nothing more nonpartisan and bipartisan than the national interests and the national security of the United States of America. And this committee certainly leads us forward in that regard. Together, we'll move that forward and appreciate working with you, Mr. Chairman. Well, thank you for having this hearing today. It is the United States' interest to promote economic freedom, which lifts hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and achieves shared prosperity. It is also in our strategic interest to protect economic freedom from encroachment by authoritarian regimes that seek to undermine free markets. That is why in 2018, Congress authorized the creation of the Development Finance Corporation, an agency with unique authorities to make development finance more efficient, effective, and impactful. I am concerned, however, about DFC's ability to balance its dual mandate to advance and protect economic freedom, particularly when this administration at times seeks to use the DFC to promote its agenda. At times, it appears some people have forgotten that development is even in the name. It comes as no surprise that the administration and many of my colleagues are eager to put DFC resources to work in specific regions, favored countries, or hand-picked sectors. But the DFC cannot be everything to everyone all at once. The DFC can play an important role with many other U.S. government agencies in an overall strategy of countering China, but the DFC cannot save the world on its own. The DFC's mission is market-oriented development. Too many mandates imposed by Congress or the administration will strangle this mission. Flexibility is key here. The DFC's success depends on its ability to find willing private sector borrowers with good projects in developing countries. The more policy writers Congress or the administration forces on DFC, the harder it will be for the DFC to find those partners. Repeated efforts to launch investments in high-income countries invite rightful skepticism toward the DFC's commitment to maintaining a development focus. U.S. taxpayers should not be subsidizing rich countries who have the money to pay for their own policy priorities. Nowhere is the abandonment of DFC's foundational principles more evident than in the energy sector. Instead of listening to what developing countries want and need, the administration is pushing a zero-carbon mandate that will fail to close the energy gap and will only push other countries closer to China and Russia who do not impose those mandates. However, moreover, it is outrageous that the agency would rely so heavily upon solar energy projects built on the backs of Uyghur slave labor. There is no place for slave labor in any DFC-supported projects, indeed for anything that the United States touches, including solar supply chains. The United States cannot compromise its values to achieve messaging-related climate objectives and must continue to make it clear that forced labor is unacceptable. With that being said, there are plenty of opportunities to enhance the DFC's work through creative legislative fixes. I'm eager to hear from the DFC on what it needs to succeed in achieving its mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Risch. Thank you for that opening statement. I think you really highlighted one of the issues that I hope we'll have a chance to get into, how you balance strategic and development goals and missions. And that's really one of the key points, and I appreciate the ranking member raising that in his opening statement. It's now my honor to introduce our witness today. Chief Executive Officer Scott Nathan currently leads the Development Finance Corporation at a critical moment for enhancing U.S. development priorities. Prior to his leadership of DFC, Mr. Nathan served in the Obama administration, including being the Special Representative for Commercial Business Affairs, at the State Department, where he led a team of Foreign Service officers and civil servants who focused on protecting U.S. economic interests abroad and advocated on behalf of American exports. Mr. Nathan also worked in the private sector and served as the board chair of the League of Conservation Voters. Mr. Nathan, I look forward to hearing from you today. Your full statement will be included in a record without objection. And I ask that you try to summarize your comments in approximately 5 minutes so we can be engaged in a conversation the way this committee, I think, performs its hearings most effectively. Mr. Nathan.
Chairman Cardin, Ranking Member Risch, and members of the committee, thank you for having me here today to discuss the United States International Development Finance Corporation. I want to thank Congress and especially this committee for its continued support of DFC. It's now almost 4 years since DFC launched, and with reauthorization coming in the next 2 years, I welcome this opportunity to talk about our organization. With your support, we're continuing to build our capacity to finance the private sector in countries where we work to make developmental and strategic impact. In fiscal year 2022, DFC did more than $7.4 billion in transactions across 138 deals. And in the fiscal year that just concluded a few days ago, we significantly surpassed that total with more than $9 billion in new deals, a record for DFC. I'm proud of our team and encouraged by our results, but I know DFC can do more, even more, as we continue to develop and execute on our strategy. DFC is making a difference through transactions in economic sectors and regions of deep strategic significance to the United States. In energy, across a range of technologies, DFC is helping to provide reliable access to power in countries from Malawi and Nigeria to Ecuador and India. Also in India, we've lent nearly $1 billion in the last 18 months to 2 projects there that advance the diversification of the solar power manufacturing supply chain away from reliance on the People's Republic of China. At the same time, with investments in Central and Eastern Europe, DFC is promoting energy security by helping communities become less dependent on Russia to meet their energy needs. DFC prioritizes transactions in high-quality infrastructure, providing support for seaports, airports, and railways that connect communities to the opportunities of the global marketplace. Over the past year, for example, DFC financing supported the modernization of a seaport in Ecuador and an airport in Sierra Leone. DFC is also investing in digital infrastructure, including safe, secure, and open information technology networks. For example, DFC supported the acquisition by an Australian company of the Pacific Island assets of Digicel, helping to secure high-quality, trusted mobile and network services in these important markets. Similarly, in Africa, we're financing the build-out of digital infrastructure with trusted equipment across numerous markets. DFC is also working to secure supply chains for minerals that are vital to U.S. national security. Last month, DFC's board approved a loan for a graphite mine in Mozambique to help diversify global supply of this important mineral away from PRC dominance. DFC is also providing support for the small businesses that are the engines of every free and dynamic marketplace. In Ecuador, Turkey, Ghana, Sri Lanka, and in dozens of other countries, DFC is bolstering the ability of banks and other financial institutions to lend to the small businesses that generate jobs and opportunity. We look to support entrepreneurship and more open economies wherever we work. Our strategic competitors do not make these kinds of investments. The United States does. Food security is another priority area for DFC, an effort that has become even more urgent as Russia's brutal and illegal war against Ukraine endangers global agricultural supply chains for communities well beyond the region. Additionally, DFC's support for more resilient health systems is helping to prepare vulnerable communities for the next health emergency. In every area where we partner with the private sector, DFC's transactions carry U.S. values of openness, respect for local laws and conditions, and high environmental, labor, and quality standards. To accomplish this, we've continued to enhance our capacity to screen transactions and monitor and measure our impact. Over our short history, DFC has significantly increased its capacity to do strategic and highly developmental transactions. We inherited a structure that provided great results, but now with a broader tool set and a dual mandate, and even higher expectations for what DFC can deliver, we need to be more strategic in our planning and more focused and proactive in our business development. To improve our effectiveness and efficiency, DFC is engaged in a process of realigning our transaction teams around a set of enduring priority sectors: infrastructure, energy, health, agriculture, and support for small business. Organizing around sectors will allow DFC to promote greater accountability by optimizing investment planning and resource allocation across our priorities and enable better solutions for our clients. This process has benefited from extensive input from all parts of our organization, and we have engaged staff through numerous workshops, interviews, town halls, and more than 100 consultations and meetings. As DFC grows to better fulfill the promise of the BUILD Act, we need to make sure we're organized to put the resources Congress has given us to the best use. Our authorization under the BUILD Act expires in October of 2025, and DFC has begun planning for reauthorization. We're eager to share our successes and challenges with Congress in the coming months and continue ongoing discussions on a range of issues, including maximum contingent liability, fee spending authority, hiring and incentives, country eligibility, and our equity and other tools. We look forward to continuing these discussions with you so that DFC can fulfill the promise of the BUILD Act. Thank you for the support that makes our work possible and for your continued commitment to helping DFC achieve even more. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Nathan, for your service and for your statement and for being here today. We'll now have 5-minute rounds for members to ask questions. And I want to start on the point that Senator Risch made during his opening statement, and that is how you are balancing the strategic concerns with development objectives. And let me just put this in context. We all understand that China's Belt and Road Initiative requires us to be strategic in how we use all of our tools, including those at DFC. But very clear about it, the BUILD Act mandated that development mandates be front and center. So how do you go about balancing the strategic importance of what you're doing with the development opportunities that are out there?
Well, thanks for the question. So the BUILD Act was very clear that we have a dual mandate, and this is a difference from our predecessor agencies, to advance the foreign policy interests of the United States and to make development impact in the poorest countries of the world. I don't see these two mandates as in tension. I think they work very well together. It's through development, through providing economic opportunity, through alleviating poverty, through creating greater stability through economic growth, that U.S. foreign policy interests are served. Stability, economic opportunity, free enterprise are directly in the United States' interest. That said, we do transactions across a range of sectors. Last year, we did over 130 transactions. We did a similar amount in the year before. So every transaction has different elements to it. Some are very explicit in terms of the national security component related to the global competition with our strategic competitors. Others are more related to economic growth. But I maintain that every deal has both development impact and advances this foreign policy interest of the United States.
And I agree with that. I don't think they're inconsistent, but it is helpful for us to have a better understanding as to how you go about making that balanced decisions. And one of the questions we have as we're considering reauthorization, is there any authorities that you currently do not have that would make that process easier for you that we should be considering in a reauthorization bill?
Yeah, I should say on the development impact, we do have a framework that's been refined over time, but it was developed at the beginning of DFC called our impact quotient, which looks at all different factors in terms of giving a development score for every deal. We also look at the foreign policy impact against the country strategies that the State Department promulgates and individual national security components. In terms of things that hold us back, we would like to have a little bit more flexibility on country eligibility. At the moment, under the BUILD Act, country eligibility is determined by income level under the World Bank income classification, and this tool is really blunt in terms of what countries are included and what countries aren't. More flexibility on that would enable us to help the poorest communities in countries that might not meet those income level classifications.
As you review this in regards to specific recommendations on including eligibility, it'd be useful if you share that information with our staff so that we can get up to where we need to be as we're considering the reauthorization language. I want to ask the question in regards to the realignment of DFC programs by sector rather than by financial product. I'm interested as to the input you're receiving from the workforce.
Yeah.
We understand there's a challenge as to whether the deal teams will remain in place or not, and what feedback you're receiving from the workforce as you make this change in structure.
So we've engaged in a process throughout the year in terms of refining our strategic priorities and then translating that into an organization that is best aligned to achieve those priorities. This process is ongoing. As I mentioned in my testimony, we've had over 100 meetings, numerous workshops, town halls, other means for gathering input from the staff in all parts of our organization. It's incredibly important to be able to ground truth, the structure that is being developed, and make sure that it's as effective and efficient as possible. That's why, as this process has gone on, we've taken that input and changed elements of it, and that will continue to be the case. You know, the organization in the 4 years since launching has more than doubled in size in terms of the employees. The structure that existed previously worked very well for OPIC, but as we grow, we need to make sure that we're able to continue to focus on business development. The key is making sure our deal pipeline is filled with the best transactions to lead to the highest developmental and strategic impact. And having an organization aligned around sectors allows us to better meet client needs, to have consistency in business development, to have focus and planning on the goals that we have for what kind of impact we can make in each sector, as opposed to by deal size or product type, which was far more siloed and relied on a smaller team. As our team grows, I think our current structure would have trouble with efficiency and effectiveness, and the realignment process and the process that's underway is designed to improve that.
I'd be interested in the specific ways that you're engaging the workforce as you make these decisions so there's harmony and understanding and input from the workforce.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we've had over 100 individual meetings, we've had workshops, town halls, interviews, and this process is ongoing.
Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to enter in the record, I've written 5 letters to the agency in recent months, 1 on solar, 1 on mission and purpose, 2 on Zimbabwe, and finally on Brazil climate matters.
Without objection.
And first of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Nathan. As you know, I put a hold on opening the office in Brazil because it was solely focused on climate, and I wanted a broader aperture than just climate. Yeah. You agreed to that. I lifted my hold. Thank you very much. That's the way things should work. Let's talk for a minute about solar. It's common knowledge, of course, that there is slave labor involved in the solar industry through China, and people are concerned about that. So what can you tell us, what sideboards do you have in place to make sure that the United States isn't financing projects that entail slave labor?
Well, thank you, Senator. I appreciated the dialogue that we've had with both you and your team since I've been in place on this important issue. I absolutely agree that there's no place for slave labor in any supply chain that gets the support of the United States. Under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force was created. And while that act doesn't bind DFC, we are following the rules that are outlined in that piece of legislation. The FLEDF list of companies that are prohibited is one that is incorporated into our contractual requirements in any solar deal we do. But beyond that, we have a strategy to diversify the solar supply chain away from China. In the last 18 months, we've made 2 investments, one to a US company called First Solar that is building and is about to open a solar power manufacturing facility in Tamil Nadu in southern India. This plant will produce cadmium-based, cadmium telluride based technology panels that have no involvement with China in any way. Recently, our board approved another transaction, a $425 million loan to TP Solar for solar panel manufacturing in India, again, diversifying away from China. This is a strategy that we want to deploy elsewhere and are looking for more opportunities to diversify the solar manufacturing supply chain away from China entirely.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a good explanation. I'm assuming that you have a team of some kind that knows the industry and the supply chain and can smell these things out if you've got Uyghur influence.
Absolutely.
Chinese Uyghur influence.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I want to talk a little bit about the balancing act that you have, and I understand it is a balancing act. I want to give you an example. Let's have a discussion of it so all of us can have a little better understanding. Suppose you're faced with a situation in a developing country where the developing country has a considerable resource or access to coal, and they want to build a coal plant. Obviously, they will contact you, and certainly they would engage the Russians and the Chinese also. How do you meet that? And obviously, you're going to say to them, is there another way we can do this other than coal? They say, no, there isn't. What do you do? How do you balance that?
Yeah, so we're constantly balancing the probability of a deal getting through all the different eligibility criteria, statutory criteria we have, the requirement to do social, labor, environmental screening, meeting the IFC performance standards. We want to be realistic with our partners, not take things down the road and then at the end of the day not be able to close on a transaction. But these transactions take time. Some of the transactions that we approved in the last year were initiated in 2019 or 2020. So this is also part of the balancing act that we're undergoing. But we look at all of the different factors involved: development impact, employment, human rights, all of the factors that go into our analysis. And at the end of the day, if we can support projects that generate economic opportunity and have strategic impact, then I feel like we're doing what the BUILD Act is intended for us to do.
Let me drill down a little deeper. So if the scenario I painted for you comes on your desk and it's a coal-fired plant or nothing, and the Chinese are going to build it if we don't, is this a no? Is that an automatic disqualifier that it's a coal?
I'm sorry, I missed the sector that you're talking about. My understanding is that its administration policy agreed with our G7 allies to provide no financing to the coal industry at the moment.
So in that case, China would wind up with a project.
Yeah, although my understanding is that China has also articulated that they won't finance coal projects either.
Yeah,
but
we've all seen how that's worked.
Yeah, I understand that. That's why I said they've articulated it.
So,
yeah.
well, my time's up. Thank you, Mr.
Thanks.
Certainly. We'll now turn to the person who can really tell you about the congressional intent of the BUILD Act, its author, Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Cardin, Ranking Member Rich. Thank you for this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Nathan. Thank you, Scott, for your leadership at the DFC. It has been a long and strange road to the moment we're at right now. The transition from OPIC and its scope and authorities and risk tolerance and mission and where the DFC is today. I respect the questions and the framing, and also share some concerns about making sure that the restructuring and the transition is oriented towards making the DFC agile, responsive, and engaged in the moment. But I want to focus my engagement with you this morning on equity scoring. One of two things that we did not do, I think, right up front, we instead gave a couple of years. The total lending cap at $60 billion as opposed to $100, and the way that your equity authority is treated is scored. Along with Senator Cornyn, earlier this year, I introduced the Enhancing American Competitiveness Act, and this is to address how your equity is scored. That bill doesn't amend the Fair Credit Reporting Act, to be clear, to those who are concerned about it. It would create a scoring mechanism to assess the fair value of equity investments, similar to how a loan is scored. And it would allow the DFC, with smaller amounts invested, to leverage much larger amounts of private capital. At least that's my understanding. I'd be very interested in hearing from you. To what extent has the current scoring of equity served as a constraint on what the DFC is able to do? Are there specific projects you could cite that you've had to forego because of the current scoring, and how would that do in terms of competing with the PRC and the development impact, which I think needs to be at the focus of everything? And if we have another few minutes after that, what other key priorities do you have before we get to reauthorization that we have to address in the near term?
Thanks very much for the question, and of course for all of your support over the years. To make the equity problem simple, we get a program budget, an appropriation for program funds that can be used for equity, that can be used for what's called positive subsidy for debt transactions that require it. That's often in countries that are in particular difficulty at the moment, Ukraine being an example of that. We also use that subsidy for technical assistance. Technical assistance grants is a tool given to us by the BUILD Act that we didn't previously have. All of these different tools compete for that pot of subsidy. Equity, at the moment, for every dollar that we invest in equity, is using $1 of that appropriation as if it's a grant, as if there's no offsetting asset by virtue of making the equity investment. It assumes that every equity investment we make will lose 100%. And while I don't believe DFC is likely to have the highest record in equity investing, it would be extraordinary to lose 100% in every single investment we make. The Cambridge Associates data on emerging market equity, private equity investments, shows on average high single-digit returns over almost any time period you look at, and I don't think we're going to be any different than that. This is a real constraint. It means we're constrained by the appropriation. We don't get the kind of leverage that we do in our lending activity. Last year, of the $7.4 billion of transactions we did, roughly $500 million of that was equity. The rest was debt and political risk insurance on a tiny bit of capital.
In the minute or two we have left, what difference would it make if we fixed your equity scoring challenge?
It would enable us to be earlier in investments, to be more influential and have a seat at the table, to provide more risk-oriented capital to developers. An example of the kind of thing that I would like to do if we had more is our investment in TechMet, which is a critical mineral investment platform with a strong pro-US bent to it. I would love to find other platforms that provide deals in the energy sector, in the infrastructure sector, in the health and agriculture sector. By backing developers earlier, we can influence their choice of vendors, their choice of other investors or co-financers. We can influence the direction and also produce potential deal flow for our lending activity. We're currently too constrained to do that. It's hard to build a team also without certainty around how much capital we have to invest. So this is really my highest priority, to fix this issue, and I appreciate your attention to it.
Well, I'll just conclude if I could. If I hear you right, one of the core goals of the BUILD Act was to strengthen our ability in development finance to partner and syndicate. Some of our key partners, South Korea, Japan, the Nordics, UK, have development finance institutions. When we only have debt, we are at the end of the process. When we have equity, we are early in the process. We can syndicate better, we can shape deals better, we can get better leverage from our very deep private sector. Frankly, we're blessed to have two colleagues here today who know a lot more about this field than I ever will. I think we need to fix this and not wait another year or two or three. And the funds that we are appropriating, and you got your full request in the Senate version SFOBs, those dollars will go much farther, and you are a critical resource in our global competition for more transparent, more sustainable development finance. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Nathan, for being here. I want to hit upon what Ranking Member Risch was talking about with regard to the energy and development. It is, on his first day in office, President Biden enacted an executive order, and I'm going to quote it here, to promote ending international financing for carbon-intensive fossil fuel-based energy while simultaneously advancing sustainable development and a green recovery. However, here in the United States, we're attempting to do the same thing. Would you agree that we're trying to move to more renewables?
In the United States, yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So who do you think is the state that consumes the most renewable energy as a percentage of their overall energy consumption? What state do you think that is? This is coming from the International Energy Administration's report. I'm not expecting you to know that answer, but if you know, jump in.
It might be your state. Is what
Oh, I wish it was Nebraska. It's not actually Nebraska. We're number 11th.
Okay.
At about 25%. The top state is actually South Dakota at 50%. But think about that. 50% renewable energy when we really are making a push here. Let's just hit some of the states around the area here. So Pennsylvania is 6.1%. It ranks number 42. Let's see. We have Maryland's 5.8%. It ranks number 44. Virginia is at 7.8%. It's number 38. So New Jersey, 4.3%, number 47. So you can see that even with the push that we have here, many states are single-digit percentage of renewable energy. And yet, you just said you wouldn't finance a coal plant. And of course, we also had the instance earlier this year where the Biden administration vetoed a $180 million IDB proposal for debt financing for Guyana shore-based infrastructure that would develop their oil and gas resources. I think 12 out of your current 12 projects out of the current active 980 are actually in that field of oil and gas or quarrying or mining and something like that. So it seems to me that if you have developing nations that are looking to become energy independent from places like Russia, that you're going to need to help them develop their energy resources. It can't just be renewable energy because that's not going to be the only thing. Is your policy to only develop renewable energy? Are your projects that you are funding only going to be green energy projects?
No. And I can give some examples. For example, in Sierra Leone, we're financing and have also recently provided additional political risk insurance to a gas-fired power generation plant to a country that has incredibly low electricity penetration to the population. It has no reliable source of electricity at the moment. This plant will be a development game changer for them in terms of providing reliable electricity. In Eastern Europe, with the energy security issues that you referenced, we've provided support through our political risk insurance and through guarantees to help the purchase of U.S. LNG cargoes in Poland, to provide diversification away from Russian gas in Moldova, and we continue to look at other energy security possibilities like that.
So when I cited that figure of just 12 are in the mining, quarrying, oil and gas extraction, are you telling me that you are actually going to be looking to expand that as far as like oil and gas, helping developing countries get more baseload energy to be able to provide that electricity as well as renewable projects?
Well, I want to differentiate between oil and gas exploration, which typically the way that DFC works is we have a requirement to be additional. If there's commercially available financing, we're not looking at the project. We're not trying to crowd out the private sector. We're trying to crowd in the private sector. And oil and gas development typically is financed at a corporate level, and then the money is pushed down to projects in individual countries. There's not really an opportunity for us to get involved in that. What I'm talking about is provision of power, electricity, reliable heating, being freed from reliance on Russian gas, freed from the reliance on dirty diesel or burning dung and waste product for cooking. These are things that I think DFC has a role in looking at.
Okay, great. Well, I would love to follow up with you with regard to that, because I do think it's important that we understand that developing nations need to have baseload energy as well as renewable, and that we open the door to Chinese or Russian influence when we don't do that, to, I think, Senator Rish's point earlier. If I can have just one more quick question, Mr. Chairman. You also mentioned earlier about trying to find the graphite, I think you said earlier.
Graphite mine, yeah.
Yeah, are you coordinating with other agencies with regard to those critical minerals to be able to develop, say, batteries, technology? Is that coordination with other people to target those?
Well, thank you for the question, because that's directly on point for the graphite mine in Mozambique. The Department of Energy is financing a processing facility in Louisiana, which will be an off-taker of that mine. So, yes, is the answer to your question.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Nathan.
Thank you. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the 117th Congress, I introduced an economic statecraft for the 21st Century Act, which directs a whole-of-government approach to confront China's anti-competitive and predatory international economic policies. It calls on for the establishment of the Office of Strategic Investments at the DFC to coordinate federal government initiatives intended to counter adversaries. What is your view of that?
Well, we incorporate strategic considerations into every investment that we make. It's a critical component of meeting our dual mandate. So anything to bolster our ability to do that, I'm certainly interested in talking about and willing to look at.
Yeah, I look at it as strategic investments that are focused on dealing with adversaries. During your nomination hearing, we discussed the potential the DFC has to be a vehicle for providing support to our friends and allies who are under increasing economic and diplomatic pressure from Beijing. I still believe that to be the case. Since the DFC was first authorized 5 years ago, what changes have you seen in China's foreign lending and development practices? And do any of these trends suggest that we should further refine the DFC's authorities?
So what we've seen is some volatility in China's lending practices. Some years really pushing out a great deal of capital, and other years being far more cautious because they've lost a lot of money in some of the areas where they've invested. And countries are becoming more aware of the quality problems and the debt burdens that go along with receiving that financing, and are becoming more wary. When I travel, I find a great deal of receptiveness to finding an alternative. People want us to show up and offer a choice, and that's what we're trying to do. These are partners that are traditionally allies of China, allies of Russia, but who are looking to diversify their relationships, and we need to be there.
Is there anything as a result of that, what you've witnessed, that requires, in your view, any changing of authorities or additional authorities in order to meet the challenge?
Well, certainly having an improved equity tool that is no longer constrained by the budgetary treatment would enable us to have a great deal more flexibility. Clearing up some of the issues related to our use of political risk insurance and full 100% guarantees would give us broader tools in that regard. Being able to operate in a broader set of countries where there's still high development potential, but currently we're constrained by the World Bank income classification levels would be another one.
I appreciate that. Now, economic development is critical to addressing challenging issues throughout the Western Hemisphere. Mm-hmm. The region is experiencing an unprecedented growth in migration due to civil unrest, deterioration of the rule of law, a corresponding lack of economic opportunity. Solving our challenges at the border, we have 20 million people in the Southern Hemisphere who are displaced from their native countries seeking refuge or asylum. They're presently in other countries. If we fail to meet that challenge, we will have 20 million feet marching north to the United States, and our challenges at the border will be minor now compared to what that would mean. So in thinking about how we deal with this, I put out a plan, and I recommended the establishment of an enterprise fund managed by the DFC to increase investment in companies across the Americas that hire a significant number of those individuals in their countries. How can the DFC work with other institutions to support economic development throughout the Americas for those countries hosting significant numbers of migrants and refugees?
Well, we're always looking for partners who can increase the available pool of financing or who can share deal flow. That could be the Inter-American Development Bank, who we're engaged in discussions with right now in this regard, more local development banks, and especially the private sector. We've done in the last year deals with financial institutions in Honduras and El Salvador totally directed at what you're talking about, providing jobs, economic opportunity, and growth in order to keep people in place and not have an economic necessity of leaving their home.
Yeah. Well, I'd commend your attention to the concept of this enterprise fund as a way to further out and achieve that goal. It's in our national interest, and it creates greater stability in the hemisphere. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Haggerty?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Scott, it's good to see you. I'd like to acknowledge Senator Coons and my friend Senator Corker, who had a great deal to do with the BUILD Act that has empowered what you're doing. One of the things that struck me when my colleagues put this together was its ability to counter China. And I think the CCP has been top of mind for us in many respects. They championed the ability of this to strengthen our hand versus China. I want to focus on that in my conversation with you today. Our balance sheet relative to China is very small. China's invested roughly $1 trillion in 147 different countries in their Belt and Road Initiative. You have a $60 billion balance sheet. So what I'd like to talk with you about is how you focus those relatively small resources. You and I have talked about my concerns over ESG-oriented investments, those types of things, which, while perhaps laudable, don't get at what our critical strategic priorities happen to be. I'd like to get your thoughts on how we deal with the fact that you have a small balance sheet, how we focus our investments. You've talked about, Mr. Nathan, investments in solar panels and things of this nature. I'm much more interested in potential dual-use infrastructures like ports, rail, air, those types of investments where we know the CCP is focused and where our presence can be extraordinarily valuable in terms of countering them. And I want to highlight that and get your thoughts on that, as well as one other thought. And this is the fact that you have the ability to hire an outstanding team. Former OPEC, the DFC is known for having really, really great professionals. And how do you punch above your weight when you have a small balance sheet? My thought would be hiring the absolute best professionals you can get. And you can lead investments even with a small equity component, as Senator Coons was saying. You can put yourself in front with the best talent. And if we can help free up your equity a little bit more, which Senator Coons and I have talked about this, I'm all in favor of doing that. But could you talk to us a bit about focus and talent?
Thank you for the questions, and thanks for the dialogue we've had over the last year. First, on the question related to strategic investments, I'm really proud of what we've done in the last year. We're going to report our results later this week, but it will include investments in the modernization of a seaport on the Pacific in Ecuador. It will include more than $500 million going to the modernization of a port in Sri Lanka. a port in Colombo, where the container terminal we're supporting looks directly at the container terminal that the Chinese are supporting. This is done in concert with the Development Bank of India. They have a very strong interest in seeing shipping in that area be free and unencumbered by coercion. Similarly, we expanded our financial support for a port on the Black Sea in Georgia, where because of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia's aggression, this has become more important than ever. We did the financing of an airport expansion in Sierra Leone, which will have huge impact on this very poor country in West Africa.
All laudable. I
Yeah.
commend that direction. I would be interested in what percentage of your total investments these types of dual-use strategic investments comprise.
From a dollar point of view, they're huge because these kind of deals absorb hundreds of millions of dollars. So I don't have an exact number, but in terms of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, the vast majority of our deals, probably $8 billion out of the over $9 billion of deals, will qualify under that kind of.
Well, let me encourage your continued focus there, a continued discussion on talent.
Yeah,
I don't have
so
to do all that today, but.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right that in a transaction-based organization like ours, without good people, we can do nothing. Human capital is the most dear thing that we have. We have a fantastic team, great people with deep transactional experience, and then the whole organization that supports that. But we're growing, and so it's a very competitive environment for hiring at the moment. Particularly for people who have deep transactional experience, the lawyers, the investment officers. I have discussed with our staff that one of the things I'll raise in reauthorization is whether we can have some greater flexibility on hiring and incentives in order to compete in this very difficult labor market at the moment. That would be very helpful.
I happen to believe that could be your key source of competitive advantage, Mr. Nathan. And in a different form, I'd love to get an update on where you stand with the Trilateral Infrastructure Project. I signed that on behalf of the United States when we put it together, so I'd look forward to getting an update from your team.
I'd be happy to do that, and I think you'd be pleased to know that during the Trilateral Summit, Japan, Korea, the United States, we also signed an agreement with our counterparts in those countries, also in addition to the trilateral infrastructure partnership that you were involved in signing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hagerty. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great to see you, Scott. Thank you very much for your service. Senator Cardin referenced the ongoing desire to open up an office in Brazil to help quarterback our increasing efforts there. And I wanted to use that as a means to talk about the way that you view the utility of DFC in-country presence. One place where DFC presence seemed to be working was in the Balkans. There was a Belgrade office that was open, and it was, a unique means for the United States to be able to project influence all across the region, even though it was located in Belgrade. Folks from Kosovo and other Albanian majority nations thought that the DFC was a fair actor. And it's closed now, which I think was a mistake. But it does seem, with the opening or the proposed opening of a site in Brazil, that you do see the efficacy of actually having some folks on site. So, I wonder if there's any opportunity to take another look at the presence in the Balkans. Over the last couple weeks, we have seen events there spiral nearly out of control. And my read is that very small investment paid dividends in terms of deals, but also had a calming effect on the region writ large.
Thanks for the question. You're absolutely right that increasing our international presence is important. Our peers in the development finance institution world have usually between 15 and 30% of their staff abroad, gathering local information, doing business development, and having a presence on the ground, coordinating with their embassies and so forth. We have 1% of our staff. We have 5 people. It's way too small. It requires funding, and it requires congressional notification. And just to make sure that we're on the same page about what happened in Belgrade, that office never opened because it never cleared in time congressional notification. There were people there on temporary duty assignment.
Right. You had a really good staffer there that people trusted.
On temporary duty assignment. This all happened long before I arrived at DFC, but I've looked into it. We are now, after a comprehensive review of where would be best to expand this presence, we now have a plan to try to take it to 3 or 4% of our staff, a tripling or a quadrupling of our staff. And we're looking region by region. There's some issues with space at embassies or where we can get people. We have to coordinate with the State Department. We have to congressionally notify every single office that we open. But we're working hard at it and have begun discussions. The Brazil office, that was funded by the State Department. As the ranking member mentioned, we are contributing funding in order to broaden out the mandate from what the State Department funding was restricted to.
Well, that's good news. I hope that you'll find bipartisan support for that effort. And again, I hope you will take a look at that region in particular. Last question is this. China takes advantage of countries with high levels of corruption and really weak rule of law. DFC cannot really operate in environments where you have public officials on the take. And so I just wanted you to say a few words about how important the work that the U.S. government does, in particular through state and USAID, to fight public corruption, how important those efforts are to your ability to find the space to do deals. This is an advantage China has. They're willing to do deals with officials who are looking for handouts. We aren't. And so my guess is that you rely on the work that the United States and Europe are doing to try to run anti-corruption programming in places that are of interest to you.
First, I'd say it's not always an advantage. I think having our values be clear, transparency, rule of law, private enterprise, is something people in these countries want to be associated with. It often actually has a political advantage to be associated with an American project because it shows that it's clean, and that has advantage. But I take your point that many circumstances, particularly in competitive situations, corruption is a problem and is an important tool. Working with our interagency colleagues, State Department, USAID, but also others who are important for helping create an enabling environment and reform. Economic reform creates more opportunities for business and business to operate. That's important for our deal flow. In terms of corruption and transparency, these are things that we're committed to making sure the standards are very high. We work with all of our colleagues at Post or in the intelligence community as we conduct know your customer work and due diligence and vetting on our partners. I mean, and oftentimes that results in information that causes us to not be able to pursue deals. But these standards are important. I don't think we should compromise our standards in order to win a deal. Having our values be clear through what we do, I think, is one of the most important elements of what DFC and the other parts of the U.S. government do.
Well said. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Romney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Mr. Nathan, I applaud you for your willingness to step away from the Baupost group to help us in the governmental level. For those that don't know, Baupost is one of the most, if not the most successful private equity and investment firms in our country. So thank you for that. I want to associate myself with the comments made by, in particular, Senator Hagerty with regards to our strategic interests, particularly as they relate to China. I sometimes feel that we in Congress and in the Senate live in fantasy land, which is we think we can do everything for everybody. We think we can solve the problems of health, of food, of energy. The list goes on and on, not just here, but all over the world. And frankly, there's not enough money for that. As we think about all the projects you might do that would deal with the issues you were just described. Our food challenges, energy challenges, creating more jobs for people, alleviating poverty. My goodness, we can't alleviate poverty here. How in the world are we going to alleviate poverty all over the entire world? We're not. It would be massively beyond our capacity. Senator Menendez, for instance, spoke a moment ago about we need to try and alleviate poverty in Latin America so there won't be as many people coming here. But our wages are far higher than everywhere else in Latin America. We can't raise the economy of Latin America to a level that people don't want to come here. And so spending money around the world to alleviate things that we wish would go away, but we're never going to get there, would only make sense, in my view, if it has a strategic significance for us, if it's something that deals with the interests of the United States of America and our national security. And I'm pleased that you indicated, yeah, that's exactly what you feel, that you have a dual mission. You consider two things. It's not easy to consider two things at once, but you recognize that a strategic interest is essential for us to make an investment by the DFC. How do you evaluate a strategic interest? What, in your view, what is the strategic interest of the United States of America?
Well, advancing our foreign policy interests, I think, includes greater stability, openness, particular countries where we're trying to strengthen democracy and our allies. We take advantage of the national security strategy and all the sub-strategies for individual countries to understand in the operating environment where we're looking at deals, what the issues are and how our deals relate. And then in a more global sense, it's what Senator Haggerty referred to, the global competition with China and other potential authoritarian governments. So that is securing for us diverse supply chains and material that we need. These are all parts of the considerations.
Yeah, I agree with you on, particularly with regards to when you came down to saying, yeah, with regards to China in particular, which is saying, how do we make sure that we have supply chain of the materials we need? They don't establish monopolies that keep us from getting able to receive the key elements that we need for our economy and so forth. That makes all the sense in the world to me. How do you assess those strategic choices? I mean, do you work with other agencies? Is it something that you deal with on your own? How do you decide, for instance, is it going to be a port we're going to invest in, or is it going to be a factory that makes widgets?
Yeah. So we take input, obviously, from all of our board agencies, so that's State, USAID, Commerce, and Treasury, and then beyond that, throughout the rest of the interagency, including the White House and the National Security Council. We have 600 people who are focused on doing and supporting and accounting for the deals. We need to take advantage of posts on the ground, our embassies, and colleagues throughout the interagency in order to do that.
Yeah, I would just close by saying that I believe our strategic interests and national security revolve around, if you will, China, Russia, authoritarian states versus ourselves, and that it is entirely consistent with your mission, as I understand it, to invest in those things that promote our national interest, that keep China and other authoritarian states from impeding our capacity to trade with the world, to lead the world, and to have a prosperous life here in the United States. And would encourage us and encourage the DFC effort not to say just how can we alleviate poverty around the world, and because that's a task monumentally beyond our financial capacity, to instead say which things are specifically in the interest, the national security interest of the United States of America, particularly as it relates to China, because that's our foreign policy and national security challenge is China, Russia, the authoritarian states. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Romney. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Nathan, I join Senator Romney in saying I think the country is fortunate to have you in this position at this time. My colleagues have asked a number of good questions. I really want to focus on Latin America, but to illuminate some issues that aren't just Latin America-based, but using Latin America as an example. You referenced, and I think Senator Cardin did in his opening comments, the fact that you are limited in where you must prioritize investments by the World Bank classification of countries by income. You should prioritize lower middle income countries, and you need a waiver to invest elsewhere. There's only 5 countries in Latin America that meet the World Bank category, and they are, let's see here, Bolivia, El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua are the only 5 that fit within those World Bank classifications. Now, by waiver, the DFC is involved in other countries, Peru, Brazil, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Colombia, Mexico, but you have to get a waiver to do that. Russia isn't worried about World Bank. I mean, China is not worried about World Bank classifications. They'll make investments wherever they think they can advance their interests. So in the current setup, we have at least put a hurdle in your way. And as I travel around the Americas, what I hear again and again from some of the nations that aren't in the 5 is, we're your friends, we're doing things the right way, we can really advance more quickly, be a good example in the neighborhood, hopefully abate some of the migration pressures, but you limit investments in our country and China doesn't. So talk a little bit about the limitation and the waiver process. Is the waiver sufficient? Or if you, as you contemplate reorganization, what suggestions would you have to Congress in this space?
Thanks so much for the question. Under the BUILD Act, to do transactions in an upper middle income country, you're right that we need a waiver from the president that it is in the economic or national security interest. That's been delegated to the State Department. We've spent a lot of time negotiating with the State Department to try to create exemption pathways for certain categories of investments so that we know in advance that we can do deals in upper middle income countries that are in those sectors. Or
so you don't have to go down the road and
for
then get
every
turned down.
single deal.
Right.
That is working. It's why in the last year Ecuador became the second biggest exposure for DFC in our whole portfolio globally.
This port investment that you talked about.
It's a port investment. It's a hospital investment. It's a power deal. It's the largest debt for nature swap in history that will help Ecuador by reducing debt to help them deal with economic coercion, and also provide funding for conservation activities and the enforcement against illegal and unregulated fishing in the Galapagos. So we've done a whole series of transactions. It's partially because we've had a government who's been a great partner and a president there who's been fantastic. He's leaving
Sadly.
office soon. But Ecuador, I think, is a good model for where it's working. But you're right, it's still friction in other circumstances.
Do you think the waiver process is sufficient to give you the tools that you need? Because again, as I'm traveling in the region, I'm hearing, wow, we wish, China doesn't have these restrictions. We wish you were a little less restrictive in this space. I completely get why BUILD would have prioritized the countries of the greatest economic need, but there are other imperative values as well.
So the waiver process is working, but is not perfect, and also creates in the areas that aren't in the exemption pathway a significant sort of time delay and administrative and just work, a hurdle.
Let me give you an example. The chairman and I met yesterday with the president-elect of Guatemala. Guatemala is not on the 5-country list. He won a surprise election on a very aggressive anti-corruption campaign. I think the U.S. would have a lot at stake in seeing his efforts succeed when he is inaugurated in January. But right now, Guatemala might not get the national security waiver or might not be able to demonstrate an absence of private capital, and yet it would be in the security interests of the United States for an anti-corruption government in the Northern Triangle to be successful. And so I would hope, I said this to the chairman yesterday, I sometimes think we spend a lot more time figuring out ways to use sanctions to punish enemies than we do figuring out ways to reward good behavior. And the DFC is one of the areas where we can reward good behavior, and I just hope that the restrictions in place don't make that unnecessarily challenging, especially vis-a-vis China. I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Nathan. Thank you for your service. The first thing I'd like to discuss is the DFC's sort of general focus. We know it's on development that's laid out in its charter. In fact, its decision-making process is advised by a council focusing on developmental priorities, and for good reason. There's definitely a need for that. One of the things the committee's going to have to think about moving forward as we consider the future of the DFC is what focus we're explicitly putting on the agency emphasizing countering national security concerns in addition to developmental priorities, something I know my colleagues have brought up. What current consultative mechanisms exist beyond the board of directors to ensure interagency opinions on national security risks or priorities from DoD, the intelligence community, the National Security Council, for example, and how are these shared and incorporated into financing decisions?
Senator, thanks for the question. You're absolutely right that these considerations are at the fore of our decision-making. The first area is thinking about where we should be spending time looking for deals. What countries, as Senator Kane indicated, for example, we are spending a lot of time in Guatemala looking for deals, despite the certification hurdle, because of all of the foreign policy and national security interests that would be involved there. And we consult with the embassy, with the State Department's regional bureau. The intelligence community is very important in certain circumstances for thinking about where our strategic competitors might also be focusing.
Is there a formal consultative process or protocol that DFC goes through to try and prioritize these different countries?
You know, there is a lot of consultation. It is not a formal process. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And perhaps would one make sense, or do you feel like a more flexible?
Yeah, I refer back to what Ranking Member Risch referred to. The flexibility is extremely important because each different circumstance would require different consultation. For example, in the Western Hemisphere, I've recently had meetings with the combatant commander for Southcom, who is very focused on economic development and the tools that DFC has in order to promote democracy and free enterprise. That's extremely valuable. But in other combatant commands, it might not be as relevant. Sure. So I think we need to be able to use the tools that are within the interagency and across the government for the correct circumstances. So, but I want to assure you that consultation and gathering information and doing this analysis is a central part of our work.
Thank you. So the other thing I want to address is financing of hard infrastructure projects, specifically digital infrastructure. Something I'd like to see in this space is the funding for strengthening digital infrastructure, like DFC support to the Africa Data Center's new facility in Kenya. These secure and reliable networks, I think, are going to have to be a priority. And you're taking some actions in this area, but we can't limit this priority to basic advisory opinions or technical support. Given limited time here, about 40 seconds, would you please comment on what DFC is doing to support grid development, in particular microgrids, and how you're coordinating that development financing with complementary bodies, MCC, U.S. Trade Development Agency, Cyberspace and Digital Policy Bureau at the State Department, et cetera?
Well, thanks for the question. And first, I completely agree with you on the digital infrastructure front. We've had recent success in that area, $300 million loan to Africa Data Centers. I'm actually heading to Ghana next week, where they're opening another data center with trusted equipment. There are other opportunities in the mobile telephone space. It's very important for us to push forward with secure, safe, open networks with trusted equipment, and that we support an alternative offering to what China is offering. On the microgrid area, we have had success in funding some of that activity, particularly in Africa, for distributed energy for areas that aren't connected to larger grids. You're right that our interagency partners often are a source of deal flow or technical expertise. That's certainly something that we rely on, and this is an area that we would definitely like to advance further. Providing reliable access to sustainable electricity is a key to development and is in our strategic interest.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Young. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Nathan, for being here. And I want to begin by recognizing DFC's finalizing the commitment for up to $300 million in the investment fund for the 3Cs initiative. I think that is a very important investment, and especially given Ukraine recently being granted a partner nation to the investment initiative, I hope you will consider this as another way that we can support what's happening in Ukraine. Like most of us on this committee, I was very disappointed that when we passed the continuing resolution on Saturday that it didn't fund Ukraine in the way that we had talked about and believe it should be. And I wonder, for the benefit of those people who say, you know, why are we supporting Ukraine? Would you talk about the interconnection between our economy here and what's happening in Ukraine, and why our investments there have some real benefit for the American public and the businesses in the U.S.?
Well, first I'd say, Senator, I think it's the right thing to do. I've been to Ukraine 3 times in the last year. Our predecessor agency had $800 million worth of exposure there through a variety of different investments, and we've continued to expand that portfolio to support the private sector in Ukraine. That's support for small business, that's in the agricultural space, that's healthcare, a thriving private sector in Ukraine, which is possible at the moment, will help them be in the position for reconstruction and recovery as opposed to being further damaged. We're committed to keeping people employed, having them pay taxes, support the war effort, and support the government. So we're trying through many different possible projects to do that, and we're starting to have a great deal of success. But in a broader way, you know, particularly in the agricultural space and food security, Ukraine plays such an important role in the Middle East, North Africa, across the African continent, the World Food Program as the biggest source of grain still to the World Food Program. It's in our interest to not have people starving around the world. It's also the right thing to do. And anything we can do to support Ukraine in that regard, I think is worthwhile.
Thank you. I would also argue it's in our national security interest not to have a Vladimir Putin who feels free to go into any country that he likes and take it, and the message that that sends to China and to Iran and North Korea is very important. I understand before I got here that you testified that about 1% of the employees of DFC are outside of the United States. Is that correct? I was very happy to see that your request, which the Appropriations Subcommittee is fully funded, includes funding for 10 DFC country offices. I certainly support that. I think it's hard for us to figure out what the needs are if we don't have people there on the ground. And I certainly share Senator Murphy's concern about the missed opportunity in the Balkans. Right now we have several countries in the Balkans that are on the verge of outright conflict, Serbia and Kosovo and Bosnia. We also have several countries there that have made tremendous progress, as have those countries in some areas, on democracy building. Montenegro and North Macedonia are members of NATO. Those are places that we want to invest because we don't want Southern Europe to explode in the same way that we're seeing the land war in Ukraine. So can you talk about what criteria you're looking at and to what extent you might be considering offices someplace in the Western Balkans?
Yeah, so as part of our strategic review of and our planning for how to deploy offices, we looked at by region where we're likely to locate offices that can be useful to a region from a connectivity point of view, to avoid, the difficulty of travel that comes up. We looked at where we're likely to get the most leverage from having a person on the ground for business development and filling our pipeline of potential deals.
And so are you looking at anywhere in the Western Balkans?
Yeah, so we would consider Europe as part of our plan, whether it would be in Central Europe and Ukraine or in the Balkans is still up in the air. One of the things about Europe is that it's easier for our people to get there from Washington as opposed to if you're looking at certain places in West Africa or in South Asia.
You haven't been to Georgia recently, have you?
Well, I was there actually a year ago. I was in Tbilisi.
You think it's easy to get there?
Well, yeah, but you should try to get to Freetown, Sierra Leone. I mean, none of it is easy. I will say in Georgia, I was delighted to visit there because DFC has a 30-year history of investing there, and obviously with our predecessor. And from Washington, D.C., we've done over 60 deals in Georgia over that history. So.
Yeah, I would hope that Georgia would be one of the places you're also considering for an office.
Yeah.
Because of its strategic location in between Europe and Central Asia. And I know I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, but let me just also weigh in and say that I certainly support the equity scoring fix
Thank you.
that has been raised and hope that that can get done. Thank you.
Well, I noticed Senator Van Hollen appreciated that you took the extra 2 minutes so that he could make it to the committee. Senator Van Hollen, if you're ready, you're up.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Shaheen, thank you for taking a little more time. And let me also just second what Senator Shaheen, I'm sure others have said about the importance of making the equity fix. I know, Mr. Nathan, that's something you've focused on. So thank you and your team at the DFC for all you're doing. I want to pick up on a question that I understand was asked earlier on political risk insurance. Because, of course, the DFC grew out of OPIC, and OPIC specialized in political risk insurance. My understanding is that we could be helping a lot of investments in Ukraine potentially, which is going to be essential for reconstruction in Ukraine, but that there's an impediment right now in terms of the scoring on political risk. Is that right? And if you could please talk a little bit about that.
Well, you're absolutely right that political risk insurance is an extremely valuable tool for mobilizing private capital, which is really what DFC is all about, mobilizing private capital to address the kinds of issues that we've been discussing today. You're also right that political risk insurance, particularly war risk insurance, is key to attracting private capital today in Ukraine for obvious reasons. Taking that tail risk off the table for potential lenders or investors is critical so that they can focus on making the commercial and business analysis and not have to worry about the larger macro or war issues. You're also right that the tool is somewhat constrained at the moment. And here I don't want to go too deep on the technicalities of it, but it's not quite for a scoring reason, but because of a disagreement about whether political risk insurance on debt should be considered as a guarantee or as insurance. The BUILD Act talks about political risk insurance as an insurance tool. That's our position, and if we are able to use political risk insurance to its full promise, I think the potential to make impact in Ukraine for financing not only recovery in the future, but today to help businesses stay alive and have money flowing to the private sector today is huge.
And this disagreement you're referencing is, it's my understanding that's a disagreement between DFC and OMB. Am I correct about that?
That's correct.
Okay. So, and if we took OMB's interpretation, would DFC actually be more constrained in providing political risk insurance than OPIC was?
You're very well informed. Yes, that is exactly the case.
Right.
The issue there is whether we would need to obligate subsidy against, or our appropriation against political risk insurance, not something OPIC ever did or we've viewed that we've ever had to do. And in situations like Ukraine, which is obviously of greater risk than most other markets today for clear reasons, the amount of subsidy that would have to be obligated if we were even allowed to do that would be very large, or we would have to price the product in a way that no person would ever accept that pricing and use the tool to begin with.
Right.
So I think you're exactly right.
I appreciate that. Look, I was here for the discussions over transforming OPIC into DFC, and I think I can speak, at least for most members, that the idea was to expand the authorities of DFC compared to OPIC, not constrain them in any way from what OPIC had. So it would be a step backwards if folks are essentially saying that DFC does not have the tools when it comes to political risk insurance that OPIC had. If I could just turn quickly to just some of the internal machinery, and I know the way DFC is set up, you need other agencies to provide input. But my team recently met with representatives from a company called Africell, which is a U.S. company investing in telecommunications networks in Africa without using Chinese technology, trying to encourage the move away from that. But they found their experience with DFC painfully slow, and they ended up going to look for others. Could you describe any way we can help you? And I know this is a sort of an open question, but what can we all do to help turn around the to help fix the timeliness of your decision so you can be more flexible and nimble?
Well, thanks for the question. First, I should say Africell is an important partner of ours. So they've received $100 million of financing. We've supported their expansion in Sierra Leone. I visited them there in Gambia, and are considering ways that we can support their expansion elsewhere in Africa. These situations are complicated. There's multiple factors that go in. They experienced some financial difficulty and defaulted on our loan. So we're in the process of helping them get through that. They've also been quite effective in speaking to people about that. But in general, I agree with the thrust of your question, which is we need to be faster. We need to be more responsive. We need to be more responsive to clients. A part of that is making sure that we're organized in a way that can address client needs with our full suite of tools that can have consistent business development in a sector related to clients. That's why we're realigning the investment organization around our priority sectors so we can have that consistency. And in terms of the process of reauthorization, there's a whole set of issues that slow us down, that create uncertainty. Some of them have been addressed today, issues related to certification and notifications. Some of it is just the nature of what we do, that through the know your customer process, there's uncertainty. Through the vetting process, there's uncertainty. It's necessary that we do that. I don't want to change our standards on that. but streamlining approvals and certifications and notifications and those kind of things would allow us to be quicker. Working with our board to be quicker with approvals is important. Getting through the kind of vetting that I mentioned in a more expeditious manner would mean that we can meet those client needs more rapidly and be more responsive.
Thank you. I look forward to following up with you on some things we can do to help. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Mr. Nathan, as you can see by the participation of our committee, there's a great deal of interest in this subject. And we do welcome your thoughts as we're moving towards a reauthorization process. I want to make one observation about the response, I think it's to Senator Murphy and Senator Romney's questions on good governance and anti-corruption. And several times you mentioned your reliance upon our embassy or mission for the information. And one of the challenges we have, and we're going to try to help you with legislation that Senator Young and I have gotten through this committee, it's now in the National Defense Authorization Act, but to build the capacity of our missions to be able to evaluate good governance and anti-corruption issues, because we find that as you're going through the strategic aspects of your work, that the mission may well be focused on how to help Ukraine or how to deal with a supply chain issue or how to deal with some other military issue, and the capacity in regards to anti-corruption doesn't always go front and center. So I'd be curious as to how you make those evaluations if you don't have the capacity within the mission to really advise you and give you the most up-to-date information about the corruption issues within the country that you're dealing with. We're trying to build up that capacity within our embassies, and we hope that that legislation will be successful in the National Defense Authorization Act. I'm going to also have a few questions for the record for you in regards to how you're utilizing the Development Advisory Council, the independent accountability mechanisms, and how you're dealing with your advisor, the specific position that you had, the Chief Development Officer. The record will remain open for till the end of business Friday for members who may have questions for the record. But before we adjourn, I recognize Senator Risch for any additional comments you may want to make. Good. If not, then the committee will stand adjourned. Thank you very much.
That's a good hearing.